welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana, 104.5 FM. Sorry, I'm playing with the microphone. It's not cooperating. Anyway, in any event, sorry about that. I will be your host. Where was I? Okay. It's time once again for, anyway, this is WRFU LP Urbana. I lost my train of thought there. Like, where was I in the spiel? So good evening and welcome. It's time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana, 104.5 FM. I got all that said. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I am here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Yeah. Views expressed are those of the speakers, in this case myself, and are not intended to represent WRFU, UCIMC, Urbana Socialist Forum, or, as we like to say on the show, UPTV, because we are also broadcast on UPTV. So we're all over the place. We're everywhere you are, or something like that. I don't know. Sorry. I'm allergic to this place, so pardon me if I'm snuffling in your ear. I apologize in advance for any snuffleupagus style behavior that I may exhibit, I may express, I may perform. Anyway, sorry. Try that. Aha. Yeah, I turned you off for a second there. Anyway, yeah, welcome. Haven't been here for a while. I've been steadily on UPTV the whole time, but various circumstances have conspired to make it difficult and or impossible for me to come into the studio to do the show here. So I have been doing it from a secret location somewhere else in the world. So yeah, I have been doing the show all along. If you're only listening on WRFU, you wouldn't know this. But if you check out YouTube and or UPTV, you would know that I have been on the air regularly, just not from this location. And so I apologize for my radio fans, all the people who listen to the radio here. But, you know, life gets in the way sometimes. And sometimes WRFU gets in the way. There, you know, it seems like last time I was here, there was some technical stuff going on that I couldn't interrupt, so I didn't, et cetera, and so on. So, getting a little colder out. Air is a bit drier, so pardon my voice in advance because I can already feel it's all dry in there. That's why I sound like this. Yeah. So anyway. Yeah, you know, stuff is going on. Right now it's impeachment stuff, so there isn't a whole lot in the immigration department, unless you count the ongoing stuff like child separation and people being locked up and so on and so forth. It's one of the things that's strange about doing this show is there are certain points that I keep making over and over and over again that seem to me to be self-evident. Maybe the most basic one, the one that I strive to repeat most often, is the fact that immigrants are people, and therefore they are just like any other group of people. They are, you know, have a million different reasons for doing what they do and for doing things the way they do it, for why they do things the way they do them. And that, to me, seems like pretty much a given. Like, you can't argue with that point. I try to make... Okay, let me let me step aside for a moment. Sitting on the radio... I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you sit in front of a microphone and you're talking and people out there are listening to you or watching and listening if it's a TV thing or a YouTube thing, it's kind of difficult to do this. And I'm not saying this like, boy, you should really respect all the hard work I put into doing this. It's not like that. I don't mean it that way. I just mean when I hear politicians or news people or whoever talking, I'm a lot more forgiving for their not being extremely clear and concise and making well thought out, consistent points. Because no matter how much you think these things through, when you're just talking, it doesn't always come out right. That's why I've often said to people, just as sort of a joke, but sort of true, that English, spoken English, is my second language. My first language is written English. I can write pretty clearly. I feel like when I put my mind to it, I can say things in a clear way. It's easy to follow. You can read it and go, okay, I get what he's saying. I understand this. You're not necessarily going to agree with me or not, but that's beside the point. But just that I feel that I can make myself understood when I write. When I speak, not so much. I am kind of generally really pleased with myself when I can say something that's even half as good as something that I could write, if that makes sense. And I'm not quite sure why it works that way. I think there are a couple of things involved there. Probably one of them is that most of the time when I'm speaking about a topic, I'm doing it in a situation like this where there's a certain amount of tension involved. It's like it's necessary for me to get it right because, there's someone listening to what I'm saying. It's not like a conversation where you can kind of say a point and then you get a response and you say another point. I'm like delivering lectures, if you will. And I'm generally doing it without notes. I don't really have notes. I have things written down that I read, news articles that I can read to you because I think there's something there that you need to hear. But I don't write out what I'm going to say, in large part because it would be very strange and stilted if I did. You notice that when I'm talking like this, there's a certain rhythm, and then as soon as I start reading news, all of a sudden it's like, no. It turns into something else. I try to read it in a more natural way than it is. One has a tendency to do when one is reading something because it's easier to listen to, because I want you to be able to listen to it and understand it without, being bored, really, because if you're reading, a lot of times it's really boring. Like, I don't know how many lectures or panel discussions or whatever you go to, but if you hang around a university town for any length of time and you find yourself like drifting over to the university to hear a lecture on this or that, quite often people will just stand up there and read their paper. It's like, I've written a paper on this subject. So rather than like, hey, I know what I'm talking about, I'm going to get up here and talk about it for a while and then take some questions and I'll answer them. It's like there's this like, oh, I really have to get all my important facts out there, so I'm going to read my paper. And that will be my lecture or my speech. And boy, is that bad. It's like terrible when people do it. Put their head down, and that's what it sounds like. And it's hard to listen to. It's hard to look at the top of someone's head, especially mine, because it's got a lot of glare up there. And, it's awful. So when I do read, I consciously try to read in a more engaging fashion than one has a tendency to do when one reads. But even so, I know that if I were to write out my editorial points, it would not be the same thing. I want to say what's on my mind. And when I do that, there's always the risk that I'm going to just start with an idea and then just kind of wander off, and before I know it, it's like I don't even remember what my point was. And that happens a lot on this show and other shows that I do. And so I'm aware that that is really possible for someone to do. And so I'm, like I said, I'm forgiving of media personalities or people who are put in media positions when it comes to saying things that aren't, they don't really, not that they don't mean, but they don't mean it to sound the way it comes out. So I know I've caught myself when I'm pontificating on some point, I'll start talking and drawing conclusions, and before I know it, I've actually contradicted myself. I started out going this way, and then I'm like, okay, wait a minute. I just came up with an argument that, kind of cancels out the first thing that I was saying. And so then I get stuck, and I have to just figure out a way out of that, like without going, okay, no, wait a minute, and turning everything around and spending a half hour trying to sort out what's going on. A lot of times I'll just take these things and leave them. So I think a critical listener could certainly, if they wanted to, go through my various commentaries and pull out all sorts of things that would just sound kind of, I won't say like nonsense, but just that don't really add up, that don't really have any kind of weight or real substance to them. And that would be a valid critique if someone were to take me to task for that, because that is the risk of what I get. The risk that I take for doing live talking, like right now, none of this was planned. I have stuff that I intend to read to you. This part here is me thinking out loud. But what I do try to do, though, is make certain points regularly. There are certain points that I firmly believe, and I try to make them often enough that no matter what, if you're finding yourself having to wade through a bunch of like, what is he talking about, kinds of moments, at least those main points that I feel are important will be repeated often enough and with enough clarity that there should be no doubt what the main thrust of my argument is. And that would be that immigrants are people. They are not a they in the classic sense of us versus them, but it's just people who come here from other places. And so there are all sorts of reasons why they do. And there are all sorts of ways that they feel they must do it. And that this basic fact, which I will argue with anybody about, because there is no question that this is true. That there is a basically true statement that I'm making. But I make it because a lot of this contrary statements, the contradictory statements that you hear out there, sort of ignore that. And they say, well, immigrants are taking our jobs, or they're using our resources, or they're bringing crime, or they're doing X. Immigrants are doing X, but immigrants aren't doing X. There may be some immigrants who are doing that. There are also immigrants who aren't. And then there are a lot in between who may have some tendencies one way and may have some tendencies the other. But it's nothing that you can say about immigrants across the board that is true about all of them. So immigrants are people. So that's why individual stories are important. Talking to people is important. Finding out their stories is important. And whenever I can, I try to do that. I don't have a lot of time. I won't go into what all I do with my time, but I am a very busy person. And I really don't have very much time to devote to like going out and trying to convince people to come on the radio show so they can tell their stories. I would love it if I could, but I can't. And it's unfortunate, because I think if more people realized how easy it is to come on the show and talk, not in terms of gatekeeping, but in terms of it's just not that hard. You sit in a chair and you talk, and we have a conversation. And but there's all this like, oh, I can't, I don't want to, I don't want to talk on the radio. I'd be scared. I'd be nervous. There's a lot of these feelings of not being equipped to do it properly or something that I think keep people back. But really, I would do a lot more of that if I could, and hopefully one of these days I will have more time, or I'll find someone who is willing to take on the task of finding guests and talking them into coming on, so that I don't have to go out and twist their arms like that. But yeah, in the meantime, I'm just going to keep doing what I do. Another point that I try to make, and I spoke about this a lot on the last show, but I'll bring it up again. This show is not as political as it seems. I am forced to be political because, in a legal sense, immigration is a political topic. I mean, it's made that way because the government has that responsibility of controlling immigration, of deciding what is and isn't acceptable, and so on. And then on top of that, political parties, one in particular, have chosen to make immigration their focus. This is an important point. You must be, on our side with this point. And so there is no way at all to talk about the topic of immigration without discussing the politics of it, and without pointing the finger at definitely an administration, and by extension an entire political party, who have made it their position to be anti-immigrant. So, I try not to do that, but I can't help it, and it's forced upon me. People can force you into a fight, even if you don't want to have it. If somebody comes up to you and starts hitting on you, sooner or later, you have to either fight back or defend yourself in some way, or they will just beat you to death. So you can be forced into situations that you would not go into on your own. I would love to discuss the topic of immigration and immigration law without being at all partisan, or without seeming to be partisan about it, but I can't do it. It's not possible in the current political climate. So be that as it may, just take those points, and there are other points that I get at all the time, but those are two of the bigger ones that I repeat over and over and over again, and I think it's important to do that. So why is it possible for there to be such diverging views on this topic? And I'll tell you one reason, and that is news. That is what the news tells you about things. Just in the same way that racism is locked into the way news is reported, and you'll see it over and over and over again. It's standard stuff in the way that they report things. It means something to be black, but it doesn't mean something to be white in terms of how it's reported in the news. White is just the norm, and then you only point out somebody's ethnicity if it's different from the norm. And that's an example of sort of institutionalized racism, and there are many, many others. So anyway, one reason that immigration, it is possible to create this strange dichotomy on immigration, warp these viewpoints, is so-called fake news. It is people misusing the power of media to spread propaganda about people, basically, ethnic groups, whatever they want it to spread about, and create this sense that there's something wrong with people coming here. There's something wrong with these people coming here. So I'm going to step sort of aside from immigration a little bit to talk about news and in particular fake news or misleading news or propaganda. So the first story is entitled How Fake News Conquered the World. And I thought this was really interesting. So it reads as follows. So much of politics today feels completely divorced from reality. This isn't new, but the sheer volume of it, the constant flood of misleading stories, contradictory narratives, and outright disinformation has changed the political landscape. The information space, thanks to digital technology, seems more out of control than ever. A new book by Peter Pomerantsev, I'm just going to say Pomerantz because I'm not sure how to pronounce this correctly. Pomerantsev. All right. A new book by Peter Pomerantsev, a Soviet-born ex-reality TV producer turned journalist and academic, claims that we're experiencing a brand of reality-bending politics that really began in post-Soviet Russia. It's a politics built on a distinctive form of propaganda, the goal of which is to confuse, not convince. It's also exceptionally cynical. The point, Pomerantsev says, isn't to sell an ideology or a vision of the future. It's to tell people that the truth is unknowable and that the only way forward is to follow a strong leader. This new style has not entirely replaced the old 20th century model of propaganda, Pomerantsev says, but it's becoming increasingly widespread. The book, titled This Is Not Propaganda, is a disturbing look into the world of spin doctors, political operatives, and digital strategists, basically all of the people working in the shadows of the information war. Pomerantsev's background gives him a unique perspective into the modern political circus, which is increasingly indistinguishable from reality TV. I spoke with him about the weirdness of postmodern politics, why it came to Russia first, and how it was exported to America. We also discuss what this new style of propaganda did to Russia's political culture and if America's future will look a lot like Russia's present. A lightly edited transcript of our conversation follows. So without reading these guys' names over and over again, I'll just go Sean, who is the interviewer, and Peter, who is the interviewee. So Sean says, I want to start by asking you how your background as a reality TV producer informs your approach to politics. And Peter says, I can definitely say it has helped me. We're in this weird place, really, since the advent of TV, and especially since the 90s, where politicians are behaving more and more like entertainment figures. And at some point, politics became very much like another reality show. In the 80s, for example, you had someone like Reagan, who was an actor playing the president. But today, someone like Trump isn't even playing a president. He's just an actor playing himself. This is something very different, and it's a big switch. I think it's changed how we practice and cover politics. We live in a new form of censorship now where we don't understand how the information environment around us is shaped. Sean says, so let's talk about how we got to this point. Your book begins with post-Soviet Russia and Vladimir Putin. You argue that this new brand of politics, this new brand of postmodern propaganda, was born in Russia in the 1990s and 2000s. What happened? And Peter says, several things happened, and they started in Russia before moving to the West. First, communism collapses in the early 90s, and Russia embraces democratic capitalism. But just a few years later, faith in democracy and capitalism begins to fade. So propagandists are negotiating a new terrain where big ideas don't matter anymore. Old social identities have collapsed. All the old professions and social roles that were in the Soviet Union have collapsed. There's no idea of the future anymore. Instead of trying to argue in a rational way, politicians become these great performance artists, trying to be outrageous, reveling in the fact that they don't care about the facts. And this is all very new. Politics becomes much more about feelings, not ideas, and you can see politicians changing their approach during this period. You can see these Trump-like figures who use similar rhetorical strategies that Trump uses today, where they say totally ridiculous things and you're never quite sure if they're serious or not. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's horrifying. And Sean says, and it's always entertaining. Peter says, right, it's a show, but the elements of the show are very interesting. 20th century Soviet politicians lie a hell of a lot, but they've always made their lies sound very respectable, as if they were the truth. They were still imitating a factual discourse, and they were representing an ideology that values the language of evidence. What was different about these new Russian politicians is that they just didn't play this factuality game at all. They didn't care about the facts and didn't pretend to care. So you couldn't really call out their lies because they were never playing that game. And this is exactly what you see Trump doing right now. Sean says, I want to be clear about what you're saying. A lot of people still think of propaganda as the art of making lies sound truthful, but that's not at all what people like Putin and Trump are after. They want to make truthfulness an irrelevant category. Peter says, it's not about proving something. It's about casting doubt. This has always been a function of propaganda, like the tobacco companies trying to make people doubt whether their product causes cancer. But overall, most political ideologies have not been about casting doubt. They've claimed to be telling the truth about the way the world is or should be. But this new propaganda is different. Putin isn't selling a wonderful communist future. He's saying we live in a dark world. The truth is unknowable. The truth is always subjective. You never know what it is, and you, the little guy, will never be able to make sense of it all. So you need to follow a strong leader. This is the way it works now, only it's spread from Russia across the world. Sean says, the collapse of faith in these grand ideologies like communism or democratic capitalism is a big part of this story. The traditional political categories or identities stopped meaning anything to people at some point, and that created this new space for whatever the hell we're dealing with now. Peter says, for sure. And Russia had just arrived at this point first, and the propagandists and the politicians found strategies to deal with it. I remember thinking a few years ago, after I finished my last book about Russia, is this the dead end? Or is this freak show a harbinger of things to come? And of course it was. The same sort of politics I saw in Russia years ago is the same kind of politics I'm seeing now in the UK and Brazil and the Philippines and the US. And the internet and digital media technologies have been the essential tools behind it all. Sean says, for your book, you went around the world talking to people on the front lines of this new information war. The propagandists, the spin doctors, the social media gurus. Do these people know what they're doing? Do they care? Are they just nihilists? Peter says, this is very interesting to me. This is something I really wanted to work out. I talked to all kinds of people, troll farm workers, digital strategists, people who helped organize Brexit. To work in this space, you have to be weirdly amoral. Most of them see themselves as political artists. They don't really care about policies or ideas. It's all just a kind of game, and they're able to disassociate themselves from the consequences. Sean says, what was the craziest place you visited while reporting this out? Peter's response, Eastern Ukraine is absolutely nuts. This is ground zero for the information war in a lot of ways. The people there have completely lost sense of reality to the point where Russian bombs are hitting civilian territories in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians think the bombs are coming from Ukraine. They'll scream at the Ukrainian soldiers, and the soldiers are like, no, it's a shell. It obviously came from Russia. But no one believes them. All the evidence in the world won't persuade them otherwise.